Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Trump spokesperson Leavitt confirmed that the White House is working on deporting U.S. citizens to El Salvador, and that's from a post from Blue Sky, kind of like the woke Twitter, I guess, from Olga Nestorova, and that's what's supposed to buy Baton for chain. And yeah, I personally don't think the government should be deporting citizens anywhere, especially without due process. But ultimately, as I've said in the previous episodes, since the government has the monopoly on the legal use of force, it can justify doing whatever it wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Ultimately, all governance is going to be subject to the discretion of who's ever in charge, and I feel like the Trump and the current White House administration realize that. It doesn't matter what's really written down and on laws. It matters when it comes to laws. When it matters how laws are enforced. And if the government wants to enforce them in a way that goes against how they're written down, ultimately they have the force to justify whatever they want to. Then we have Here We Go Again from CNBC.com. And that's the story. Trump temporarily drops tariffs to 10% for most countries, hits China harder for 125%. That was by Ragnar OKXG. And yeah, I don't really care for any tariffs or trade wars, but as I said in previous episodes, the Reddit only doesn't like them because Trump's doing them. If Biden was doing them, like he did some tariffs on China and kept up Trump's trade war on China, they were fine with it then. But Trump does it, and it's the worst thing ever. And yeah, I personally don't really care for all the cheap Chinese goods that kind of fill the market over here. But if people want to buy them, they have every right to. And I don't think they should be tariffed because they're made in China. Even if I don't really care for the Chinese government, Chinese sellers have every right to sell their products here at the same price that American sellers do. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Benny Johnson on stock market crashes, 2025 versus 2024, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the centrist subreddit. And yeah, back in 2024, he said, "Oh, the stock market crashes are the worst thing ever." But now that Trump's in power, he says, "Oh, stock market crashes build character." It just goes to show you how, when it comes to a lot of grifters like him, it doesn't really matter what's happening, rather than who's in power. And that, that's a lot of Reddit as well. Reddit. When we were pretty much in a recession in 2022, we had two negative quarters of GDP growth, but then they redefined recession, and Reddit was completely fine with it. But if that happened under Trump, Reddit would say that's not right. And it just goes to show you how Reddit will always make excuses for blue authoritarianism while decrying red authoritarianism as the worst thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have attorney who resigned to protest Trump's law firm deals, speaks out, criticizes Doug Emhoff for his complicity, and that's from Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the FOMOS subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't think, if she wanted to resign and go on CNN, that's fine. I personally don't trust lawyers regardless of their ideals or beliefs. They're just not a trustworthy group of people, I would say. They're probably not the most untrustworthy group of people. I would say that would be politicians, but they're definitely up there. And yeah, of course Reddit's gonna bend over backwards for her because she says Orange Man bad. That's really Reddit's only values at this point is Orange Man bad. And it's just like, how Reddit thinks, they say, "Oh, I don't care for Liz Cheney," but she says Orange Man bad, and suddenly, they are completely fine with Kamala campaigning with her. And yeah, it just goes to show you, Reddit's value system, that a lot of people say they have values, but they really don't. They're just they just believe whatever the current narrative is, and since this woman is upholding the current narrative, they'll obviously like her and give her tons of upvotes and circle jerk her a lot. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have From Tatooine to Liberty, How Star Wars Forged My Rebel Soul from Humbly My Brain, Substack.com. Posted by Humbly My Brain, they said, my first memory of the movie theater dates the summer of 1977. I stood with my family in a long line beneath the warm Southern California sun, waiting outside a modest two-screen cinema. Inside, we were settled into a pre-stadium seating, old creaky chairs, where as a child I prayed I wouldn't end up being behind a tall adult, craning my neck to see the screen. The floor stuck to my shoes with spilled soda and crunch of popcorn underfoot. Then the iconic Star Wars fanfare blared, and the title scrolled across the screen. That moment etched itself into my mind. On that day, I became not just a lifelong fan of George Lucas's galaxy far, far away, but also a rebel in spirit, drawn to the classical liberal ideas and Austrian economic principles that I later realized underpinned the rebellion's fight in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And, yeah, I feel like that Reddit, a lot of the time gets the stereotype as, being over reliant on fiction, so this is just like Star Wars. I think it's fine, like, do what this guy's doing and say, Star Wars is probably one of the more libertarian fictional properties, but it gets kind of tiring, when Reddit says, oh, this is just like Harry Potter, or oh, this is just like Star Wars. They can't even do, oh, this is just like Harry Potter anymore since J.K. Rowling joined the outgroup when it came to the transgender issue. Now they're always saying, oh, this is just like The Handmaid's Tale, and if you want to compare things to fiction, that's fine, but I definitely think that's very much a Redditor trope. Just saying, oh, this is just like X, and it's just like read another book. That's I think that was the old thing when they would compare everything to Harry Potter. Just like read another book, and yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Nothing Can Keep It Out. The tariff issue enters every American home, May 22nd, 1912. Now I'm supposed to buy U.S. I'm supposed to buy Help of Eating, and that's crossed from the propaganda poster subreddit, and that looks like the light from the Democratic headquarters. It says Republican tariffs responsible for the high cost of living, and that shines through the door. And yeah, so that would have been that's kind of like the same thing today. The Democratic Party is saying, oh, the Republican tariffs are the worst thing ever. But, Joe Biden was just in power, and he issued he did tariffs on China and all that, and Reddit didn't care. So, it's just political propaganda. That's what it is. That's why it's on the propaganda posters subreddit. But, of course, Reddit, Reddit's pretty much just all propaganda at this point. But Reddit doesn't care. Even if they acknowledge it, they'll just say, oh, it's propaganda I agree with. And that just goes to show you how, Reddit, they just want their circle jerk. They don't want any debate or discussion. They just want to jerk themselves off. And that's very much what social media as a whole, I would say, too. It's pretty much nothing but political masturbation at this point. Then we have President Trump just asked the Supreme Court for the authority to fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell from Donald Key, and that's crossed from the Stocks subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Jerome Powell. I think he should have the ability to fire him if he wants to. But with that being said, he was the one who appointed him in the first place. So I don't think Trump's blame free on the issue either. I think if he wanted to go full libertarian and abolish the Federal Reserve, I would like that. But I don't think that's realistic at all. I think we'll just get another guy kind of like Jerome Powell in there who will ask to fire in a couple of years as well. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump's top advisor, Peter Navarro's books frequently cite a made-up scholar named Ron Vera, who appears to be his alter ego. And that's from BusinessInsider.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. And that's across from the Moderate Politics subreddit. And yeah, I personally think that's probably him, since Ron Vera is an anagram of Navarro. And if he wants to cite himself as an alter ego, I think that's fine. But I do think that's kind of cringy. And yeah, I would agree with that being kind of cringy. But if he was Joe Biden's top trade advisor, Reddit would say, oh, that's just something stupid he does. Because Reddit would always try and defend the in-group and discredit the out-group, and this is just another post about that. That's pretty much every post on Reddit at this point. Then we have Let's Run America Like a Business, posted by Maddie O'Clock, and that's a self-post that they made. And they said, if you're a business and you constantly break contracts with all the other businesses as well as your consumers and your employees, sift them on payments, withhold goods and services they already paid for, do you think you would survive long? If Amazon didn't deliver what you ordered and their customer service said, not our problem, and hung up, would you keep buying from them? And I would agree with that. The thing is, unlike a private business, government can't go bankrupt. The U.S. government has one of the largest debts in the world right now. But if it were a private company, it would be bankrupt. But since government's inherently monopoly, it can't go bankrupt unless there's a revolution, I guess, and then you get a new one in there. And yeah, that's why I personally think I agree with if you want to run America like a business, that's fine. But you have to remember that businesses can go bankrupt, but the U.S. government can't go bankrupt. It's personally why I think, if it were up to me, we'd have a voluntary government rather than forced collective governments. If people don't like the one they're in, they could just form a new one. But right now, we have currently, you have to obey the laws of whichever government's in power in your area. And yeah, I don't think that's very, libertarian. I think the libertarian position is, if anyone wants to, libertarian position is support secession down to the individual level. If you don't like what your government's doing, you should be free to secede and make your own government. And, and form voluntary collectives of suffrage rather than the forced collectives of the state as we see it now. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have U.S. Supreme Court tells Trump administration to facilitate return of Salvadorian man depicted deported in error from Reuters.com posted by EOX. And yeah, I personally think that they should return him since he wasn't a gang member. But ultimately, if they don't want to return him, they are ultimately the ones with the control over the monopoly of force, so they can justify doing whatever they want to. And sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And we have Trump is now commanding his cabinet and loyalists to wear Trump golden bust pins instead of American flag pins. And that's from Ragnarok HD, and that's from politicalflare.com, and that's from the Anything Goes news subreddit. And yeah, that's another Orange Man bad post. I think that's kind of a stupid idea, but Trump has always been there to jerk himself off, so that sounds like something he would do. And yeah, I personally would just ignore him and his shit like this. Nothing would really hurt him more. But, since you keep paying attention to it and falling for his rage bait, he's just going to live in your head rent-free forever. And that's pretty much, might as well be the official thesis of Reddit at this point, I would say. Just let Trump live in your head rent-free forever. That seems like what, Trump wasn't even in power for 4 years and he still lived in their head rent-free. So, yeah, so that just goes to show you, I just ignore Trump rather than constantly jerk off how bad he is. But, if you want to jerk off how bad he is, you should be able to do that, He's kind of an insufferable spaz, but, if eventually, it's only playing into his hand of him living rent-free in your head. Then we have entitled to reimbursement. Trump DOJ says January 6 defendants deserve to get restitution refunds after having cases invalidated. Posted from lawandcrime.com, posted from Swamp Yankee Dan, that's crosswords from the law subreddit. And, yeah, ultimately, I don't think they should be entitled to anything, but, if the government does think they're entitled to reimbursement and wants to justify giving the money, ultimately, I don't think that's being fiscally responsible, just giving the money even after they've been pardoned. But, the government, that's the government for you, they'll just reward who's ever in the in-group, while ostracizing who's ever in the out-group. That's why, it's generally seen that, blacks vote Democrat, so the Democrat gives a lot of inner-city blacks a lot of welfare as a reward, and that's why the big cities usually always vote Democrat. And, yeah, I personally, don't really care for it, but, if the government could justify doing whatever it wants to with its own resources, I guess, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Then we have House Budget Resolution Vote, What's Changed? And that's an archive link from the New York Times, posted by Baton 13. And yeah, personally, I don't think this new budget's gonna work. They might cut some stuff, but I don't think they'll never go through with cutting anything meaningful. And yeah, they're always saying, oh, we're going to cut this, or we might reduce spending here, but they never seem to go through with it. And then, they'll just spend like there's no tomorrow, regardless of which branch of the Uniparty is in power, and the national debt will keep increasing. And yeah, I don't know how sustainable this is. It hasn't collapsed yet. There's been no collapse yet, but I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Then we have MAGA beekeeper admits Trump tariffs have cost him half his business. I never thought I was going to lose this much money this fast, the beekeeper told CNN from the dailybeast.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, just because it's a good reason not to worship any politicians, because they could always screw you over. I know Reddit's kind of gloating right now because the Trump tariffs are screwing over a lot of Trump voters. But I'm sure if Kamala Harris was the president, they would be justifying everything she did, and they wouldn't care if it screwed them over or not. That's why it shouldn't be overly partisan. 40% of voters, it seems like, will go Republican no matter what. Like, Trump could literally start bombing their houses and shooting at them, and they'd still vote for him. And it's the same thing with 40% of Democrat. 40% of voters who vote Democrat, Kamala Harris could start bombing their houses and shooting at them, and they'd still vote for her. So it just goes to show you how, you gotta seek your own well-being over your political team. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.